Hi everyone, it's 5 o'clock, so I think we'll get started. Thanks for taking some time out to listen to me talk a little bit about the Premier's announcement and the business case that was announced last week, and the decision by the state government to proceed into the next phase of Westport, which is the definition phase. So I'll now share the obligatory slides to sort of support the conversation, and then at the end we'll come back and do a bit of a Q&A. So I think we're doing questions and answers in the chat. Is that right, Luke? That's right. So if you've got questions you've got now or as I'm talking, feel free to lodge them into the chat bar and we'll get to them at the end. Excellent. So last week's announcement, obviously the Premier announced $273 million in funding for the definition of the Westport program, inclusive of some key land acquisitions required to allow the port to be delivered. Now, I've shared with you sort of this picture at the bottom left each time, which are the stages of infrastructure planning as it relates to Infrastructure Australia and the state government. So we've now moved from from stage 3 to stage 4. So effectively, what the money has been allocated towards is in infrastructure planning, you work through a business case, which is to decide if the project has economic merit or if it's a good idea, if it's basically going to deliver more for the state and the future economy than it will cost to build. And that's what the purpose of what we've done to date is. So obviously that's about doing enough design so you can get a good cost estimate, understanding the risks and then assigning a cost to those risks, so to increase what it could cost. And then to doing some analysis of deliverability in terms of, can we get approvals for this project and all those sort of things. Now, obviously we went, as you're aware, a lot further in that stage of the program than you normally would, particularly around stakeholder engagement and community engagement, around environment and around heritage and social considerations, simply because it's such a big project in such an important place that we thought that the standard process of leaving that till after the business case has been approved was not the right way forward. And we wanted to have that information to inform our design and our business case models going forwards. And that's been really good. It's added a lot of richness and a lot of information into our decision making and our planning, and really allowed us to relay some of your information, your concerns, your risks and your views into our design, but also up the chain to government as part of the business case consideration. So I'll just go through a little bit about what was in the business case. A public summary was made available, which there's a QR code there if you want to link to it. I would make the case that obviously the full business case has not been made publicly available. That's not really generally standard practice. There's a bunch of information there, commercial and financial information, which isn't useful to share. And I'd also acknowledge that the environmental and social considerations in the business case are it is an economic document. So it's what we had enough information in there to articulate that we were going for a very robust level of regulation and assessment, and that we'd done a lot of work to understand the risks. But a lot of the information around environment and other concerns will actually be shared publicly through the environmental review process, the public environmental review, which will happen next year or shortly afterwards. So in terms of the business case, the first thing obviously is what we're trying to deal with is that our state keeps growing as an economy. In fact, these trade forecasts were done in about 2022, I think, they were completed. And what our trade forecasts have actually reduced their growth from what was forecast previously by the Westport Task Force. Their expected rate of growth was higher, but we look back and sort of consider that actually things like the global financial crisis, COVID-19 and other shocks happen, and they will continue to happen. Right now the world's in a very interesting space, particularly with what's going on in America and China and the Middle East. So there are shocks which happen, and these have a periodic impact of actually just knocking down growth in trade. So for those things, once you built the models, we reduced the trade forecast for a little while. And we also indicated that over time, as our population grows and we become richer, is that actually our purchasing will become less, we'll buy better and longer lasting products. And that's why you see that trade forecast decline into the future. It's still growing, but it's not growing quite as fast as earlier. So these trade forecasts obviously is the basis of what we've got to achieve. And that gives us an indication about how many containers we may have to deal with. And obviously we do high forecasts in terms of if everything goes exceptionally well, and low. There's been some conversation about, the trade forecast has only been 1.5% for the last year. Now, that was the year before last. After COVID, there was 1.5% trade growth. That's not a future that we really want to support. If we only grew as an economy to have like 1 to 1.5% growth, our economy would actually be in quite serious strife. So that's not something we wanted to support. And I think that was just coming out of the COVID doldrums. The last 12 months, the growth has actually been 6% in response to that. So we've seen a massive step up, but we can't plan for 6%. We shouldn't plan for 1.5%. So we plan for a good, sensible forecast going forwards. In terms of the issues facing Fremantle Port, there's a lot that can be done on key lines of ports to improve efficiency. And I know our stevedores continue to look into those opportunities. But there's very little land around the port. Of course, Fremantle used to be an industrial hub. It's now a tourism and residential hub with a port sitting in the middle of it. And really, there's not that much land to grow into their services and the empty containers and other things that need to happen around the key line and around the port operation. A lot of the land's been bought by private companies and using it for other uses or using it for housing. And so acquiring that land back and then sort of putting containers on it or other activities is really a hugely expensive exercise. In terms of community and safety, of course, the port is the port, but as we well know, the road and rail alignments out of it are heavily constrained. Working with councils around the areas, there's a frustration from some of them that the date has been pushed back from the early 30s to the end of the 30s because of the increasing trucking. But obviously, when you're talking about such a substantial investment like this, you really don't want to make it too much earlier than you need. You want to have it in place just before you need it. Not right at the same time because things sometimes go wrong. It needs to be just before. But obviously that we'll see increased trucking in and around that location. And the state government obviously continues to invest in subsidies for rail to try and maximise rail in and out of Fremantle until such time as Westport comes into play. Fremantle is an old port. It's great and it's great now. I mean, it continues to function well as a port right now. And I think it's important to sort of reiterate that we're not coming up with a business case saying that the problem is right now. If the problem of Fremantle was serious today, then we would be in real strife as a state because it takes a long time to design and build something this large. And you really need to start, obviously, we're saying about 15 years in advance. So it's good that we've had the time to do this planning now, and we've got time for an orderly and sensible construction, both that considers the environment properly and also doesn't rush things. So you have to pay more for that development and construction as well. But the port's infrastructure is ageing. It's been around for a long time servicing. And over the next 15 or so years, you're going to start to see some of the key lines and the berths require replacement, which is a substantial cost, which you wouldn't invest in or you would do differently if you knew you were going to move out. And so that was some of the issues. Ship sizes, Fremantle can only accept vessels carrying up to around 12,000 TEUs. Shipping is one of those things which is a bit dynamic around the world. It does change, so we'll be keeping an eye on this. Again, we don't need to worry about this right now. I think the biggest ship coming in at the moment is around about 10,000 TEU mark. We're not forecasting that this is a problem today because the ships aren't coming to Australia that are that big. But we've had 2 different studies looking at what's being built and dismantled around shipyards around the world, and they've both indicated that they expect these larger ships to be coming in the early 30s, which is still a fair way before Westport would be built. But we want to really minimise the amount of time between these larger ships coming to Australia, to Sydney and Melbourne, for example, and not stopping at Fremantle because it's considerably more expensive for us to just have to deal with the shuttle smaller vessels from Singapore. And lastly, and it's important to note because it was part of the Premier's announcement, the highest and best use of that peninsula. So there's 270 hectares of land, which has got an extreme, as you can imagine, the most, one of the most wonderful views and positions in the world, really, looking out over Rottnest on one side and then over a harbour to Fremantle, Old Fremantle on the other. But at the moment, it's just tarmac with boxes on top of it. So in a city which we know we have a problem with sprawl and it's getting worse and worse, and in 15, 20, 30 years time, you know, we're really going to have to think about ways of making sure we don't put people 80 kilometres away from the CBD. Being able to put people in a location like this and commerce and other things will be really, really valuable. I would say that we didn't include the potential benefits of that redevelopment in our economic analysis. You know, I think it was done previously that there was an assumption of, you know, X billion dollars of return or value to the state of putting people here rather than the fringes of Perth over time. But we tried to keep it a bit purer and just focus on whether it was a good idea based just on freight alone and the impacts on the economy. And we've just acknowledged this as a qualitative benefit, but not actually included any financial benefits from that in our final analysis. In terms of why Kwinana was the best location, I mean, of course, there was a lot of work done to 2019, which flagged that this was the best location based on a range of different factors, considering Bunbury and extending Fremantle into the Indian Ocean and different locations in Cockburn Sound, not where we've got the port. But this location is better. It's already an outer harbour. It has been for decades. There's 850 very large freight ships enter there every year, and we'd be adding about 10% to that in the first year. It's not like this is a new activity in Cockburn Sound. And you know, small boat craft operate around all those large vessels all the time, and all we're doing is adding 10 or 15%. Admittedly, these vessels are a bit bigger, but really in terms of safety and other things, there's not that much difference. It's located in the metro region, and again, this work was done in stage 2, and we've reiterated that if you try and put a port a long way away from the location that containers are unpacked, everyone pays through their nose for that. The transport cost and the emissions of trucking everything up and down from Bunbury or from Geraldton or south of Mandurah, it just becomes really problematic. You cannot have your port too far away from your demand centre. And in Western Australia, as you can imagine, the vast majority of, I think it's over 90% of our containers are unpacked near the metro area to the east of that location. And so that's really where we need to be close to. Kwinana has road and rail freight network or the opportunity to expand those networks in places where there are not, you know, hundreds of people's driveways every couple of hundred metres like we have in Leach Highway, and where we can establish buffers like there are in the eastern states, where you have 20, 25 metres between the major freight routes and people's houses or other uses, as opposed to 4 metres that we have on some of the internal Fremantle roads between the freight links and people's front yards. So it's obviously something we can establish these links, but really importantly, we can protect the land around those links so that it never gets built out like this in the future. And so we protect our major freight supply chain for the next century. There's a lot of industrial land, over 1,000 hectares, under investigation to release into the Western Trade Coast. So having our major trade gateway in a location where there is industrial land that new businesses can move into is fantastic. Obviously, all of that industrial land has been, you know, most of it has been subsumed and then put, you know, housing and other activities on it in and around Fremantle over the last century. So it's great that we can actually provide that sort of additional benefit of having supported land. And of course, Kwinana aligns with other state and government objectives. You know, they've got the Global Advanced Industries Hub, which is going to really catalyse this location for our economy. It's one of the most important economic nodes in Western Australia, outside of Dampier and Port Hedland as iron ore export ports. This location is an extraordinarily valuable economic and industrial location. If we weren't to do anything, I think the key things are that we'd reach a point at the end of around the end of the 2030s, obviously depending on trade forecasts, which are, you know, forecasts only. But the best estimation is around at the end of the 2030s, we will run out of capacity to efficiently get containers out of Fremantle. And the next container that someone wanted to import or export would have to be shipped to Sydney, which is further than Fremantle from Singapore and some of those key hubs. So additional shipping, additional emissions from shipping, and then put on a truck and train and brought across the Nullarbor to Perth. And of course, we know that the Nullarbor single road and single rail track is either on fire or seems to be underwater on a seasonal basis at the moment as the effects of climate change become worse. So that really impacts not just on cost, but the reliability of that as a supply chain. It would increase the cost of each of those new containers substantially for the business that was importing them, and would ultimately, that additional expense would make some business activity unviable. So apart from being more expensive, and so therefore those costs are passed on to all of us in terms of what we buy every day and business operation, just the impact on businesses not being able to operate and not being able to export or import to the level they'd like to because they can't afford to, would create a huge handbrake on the economy over time, which starts off small. And so, the risk isn't massive in the initial stages, but becomes huge as we go through it over the next sort of 30 to 40 years. So it's now something we can do without, basically. And that's not surprising given we only have one container terminal on the western side of the continent. In terms of transition and timing, we looked at a couple of different ways to sort of mitigate cost and to keep Fremantle going if we wanted to. The first was to have 2 container terminals, a couple in Fremantle and a couple down in Kwinana. This ultimately wasn't a good, that would help deal with some of the failing berths and infrastructure in Fremantle. Ultimately, this is a bad idea, because you'd have to maintain all the heavy freight infrastructure into both locations. So you'd still have to spend a lot of money in Kwinana and you wouldn't really get the benefits. Second of all, you'd have 2 very different operations, one in Kwinana and one in Fremantle, and having to price regulate that is extremely complicated to provide an even playing field for operators to work on. And ultimately, it was a very inefficient and very expensive way of keeping things going. And particularly because with the dredge volumes that we're going to require for the ship sizes we're studying, we need to put that dredge material somewhere, and rather than have a big spoil bank somewhere in the environment. So we want to reclaim the land with that. And if you're going to reclaim with the land with that, you're going to end up with a large footprint that can take 4 berths anyway. And so it didn't make sense to only operate 2 of those. We looked at remaining Fremantle to the late 40s and identified a series of infrastructure upgrades and policy upgrades that could be undertaken. A second bridge next to Stirling Bridge to widen that to 4 or 5 lanes in both directions, a second rail bridge, so effectively 2 more bridges in that sort of Fremantle locale, some major grade separation or interchanges at the Stock and Leach Road intersections as well, and some potential acquisition of land around Fremantle Port. And ultimately this added up to to over $2 billion, and that would have given us an extra 10 years in Fremantle in terms of by solving the supply chain around it, and that was not considered as something the government wanted to invest in, because ultimately then you'd still have to invest in Westport, and it was better to do it earlier rather than later. In terms of the commercial model, we looked obviously at a lot of different ways of how we could minimise cost to the public in this. So that was obviously looking at different opportunities for private investment, some global commercial analysis and market testing, and ultimately, it's such an important piece of infrastructure to our economy, one of the most important pieces of economic infrastructure in the state, and ultimately financially in the long term, even though it costs more for the state to build it without private investment up front. It was identified that in the long term, it's financially better for the state to maintain this asset rather than outsource it or go into a 99-year lease, which has been done for the vast majority of major container ports around Australia. And also because of the sensitivities of building this in Cockburn Sound and near our defence partners, it was thought best to maintain control to make sure we can manage the environment properly and manage the interface with defence properly going forwards as well. In terms of the preferred design, you would have all seen this before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's just to remind everyone that Westport and what was announced is, yes, the port and the dredge and the channels and the breakwater and the backup port location. But we've also just started the landside program. We've just awarded the design of Ankertel Road West and the Kwinana widening program, which will proceed through definition again to inform a final investment decision by government in a couple of years. I would note with Kwinana, this has come up a fair few times, so it's probably worth just acknowledging that on day one operation of the port in, let's say, the late 2030s, we will have widened Kwinana to add 50% new lanes, so add a lane in both direction at least. So that's going from 2 to 3 lanes as well as smart freeways technology to help manage congestion. So we will have added 50% of capacity to Kwinana Freeway at least, and then container trucks will form 1% of traffic on Kwinana Freeway. So it's just important to understand that people get concerned when they see this diagram, oh, we're going to create congestion on Kwinana and Roe. It'll actually, the plan is to alleviate congestion considerably by those widening, and that's a lot of the benefit from that will go to just the commuters, which are stuck in traffic jams there every day. Obviously then wider heavy freight trucking, which I think is about 4% of traffic on there, and then containers will form about 1 to 2%. So it really isn't going to sort of, it's actually going to really assist every other user on Kwinana and Roe. Over time, of course, we'll continue planning for Anketel Road East to connect it to Tonkin Highway, and a number of years after the port opens, it's likely that things will flip and then the container vehicles will drive all the way along Anketel to Tonkin Highway to get up to that district after some time. In terms of environment science, of course, as I said, we often do a lot of this work after the business case stage, but at this point we went well beyond business as usual to try and make sure that the environment was considered right up front. And it's because it's very much a beyond business as usual project. It's a really important place to a lot of you and to a lot of people here in the office as well. We wanted to make sure we did it properly, and we're really pleased that government supported us doing that by allowing us to invest a considerable amount of money in actually understanding the environment, not just to tell us how to minimise and avoid things. And we've moved the port to the south to get it off the off seagrass meadows. We've adjusted the breakwater so that it's open at both ends to avoid the need for defence to do a lot of dredging and to allow the currents to not be interrupted that flow around Coburn Sound, so it can flow through the port precinct. We've put the dredging, the channels through the old dredging scars of Coburn cement and then into deep sand areas where it's too deep for seagrass to grow. So a lot of this science has already led to changes in design and footprint to minimise impact, and it's also going to inform a lot of the work which is going to our EIA, which will all be publicly available. I think all of the science reports will be published within the next 6 months. And then you'll all be able to see that through the public environment review, how that's been combined into our planning about environmental protection and management as part of that public environmental review process in early 2026, I think. The other thing is that we've done that work not just to inform our EIA. A lot of that science was actually to also support us come up with good plans with a bunch of stakeholders and experts. So we just didn't do this in-house. We involved Coburn Sound Management Council, Wreckfish West and others in coming up with a program of projects like seagrass replenishment, artificial reefs and those sort of things which can improve the environment. We are going to have an impact when we develop this project, but the opportunity to improve it beforehand, to build resilience and then improve it afterwards means that in the long term we still have that goal of sort of making sure that this is a positive environmental outcome. And we've also done that science in a way that can be picked up by the wider government to manage the whole Coburn Sound, not just for Westport, but for the other projects like the defence projects, like the Kwinana bulk terminals and jetties and other activities happening in Coburn Sound. Just in terms of our approval process, we've already referred the document, the scope, which is just letting everyone know that this is the project and this is when it's likely to happen in March 2024. We've released our assessment scoping, so that is basically what is going to be included in our public environmental review, and that's out for comment to make sure people are comfortable that what we're going to include in our document is what they want to see. And then, as I said, the PR and the public assessment, which will be several months available to the public, will be in 25-26, where people can then make their comments on the actual proposal. In terms of next steps, as I've said, the funding has been provided for definition at this stage. So on the chart on the right, definition is in the aqua or the teal. Sorry, I keep getting those colours wrong. And the cross-hatching is the delivery. So the government has invested in all that definition work. So we will get the reference designs completed. We will resolve or deal with all the big risks that we are uncertain around. That could be other utilities that need to be moved out of the way to allow the infrastructure, or the geotechnical situation that we're building the port on to allow us to maybe redesign it in a more effective and efficient way. And obviously, we'll also include the environmental approvals to make sure that we've dealt with the environment to the standard required by the regulators and the community before government makes a final decision to build it. Our priority will be building Kwinana bulk terminal initially. We want to have that bulk terminal built and completed by the end of 2031, with the rest of the marine infrastructure flowing after that. And after we've done our job, we will be procuring the port terminal operators, so the stevedores and the rail operators later on, and then they will come and build their topside handling equipment afterwards, all wrapping up then at a point in the late 30s where we can start the transition. So that's the plan, but of course the government has just, on our advice, has just allocated us the funding to get to the end of definition, and then they will decide. There's a lot of water to go under the bridge in the next couple of years before we get to that point. There's a lot of things happening around the project and around the world, which we need to make sure we factor into our program. Just on community engagement. So again, we just didn't think that we should wait till after the economic case had been made to really understand what you were concerned about and how we responded to that. We just did a very recent community survey. It was a great response, 800 responses, which is a lot more than you'd normally get for a project like a sort of government infrastructure project. But again, warranted given the interest in this project. The top 5 things people were concerned of is unsurprising. So marine environment, road upgrades, and how we're going to manage those road upgrades to do with other congestion and matters. And it's pleasing to know that we've now looked at those roads for all traffic and rail, for all traffic and rail users, not just for containers. And that's allowing us to sort of design for the ultimate of what everyone needs. Freight rail again, so we're looking into that, and particularly with residents in Coburn. So that we've already, again, pre-business case, had conversations with those communities around their concerns around noise, vibration, and we'll continue to work with them over time. Duplication of freight rail is not the #1 priority at the moment. We don't really need that in place until the port opens. So we've got a lot of time to work through those solutions with the local community in that area. Terrestrial environment, which is obviously key to Anchortail Road and other activities, is being considered, and we've got already investing in purchasing and securing really good blocks of remnant vegetation and others around the Perth Metro and other areas. And then local traffic, as I've sort of said, is a concern for people, which particularly while we're constructing, we will put a lot of care in response to this concern into how we're going to build this stuff and not create just a snarled mess for everyone trying to drive north and south along Rockingham or along Anchortail while we do so. You can't do this without any disruptions, but we're very aware that we need to look after the industry which is operating on the Western Trade Coast, and also the commuters trying to get through it up to Perth and back again. Usefully, what I was really pleased is that there's a pretty high proportion of people who know about Westport, which is unusually high again. Again, I think there's a lot of people who recognise the importance of Westport, and I note that that's actually the importance of getting it done, but also the importance of getting it done right. So I think that's where I'm going to end. We've got this slide. This is going to be circulated, isn't it? Okay, so there's some links in here and QR codes that you don't need to quickly get up and snap now. You can have a look at them later when we circulate it. But at this point, I might stop sharing. Is that right?
Or just leave it open. I think that's fine.
Okay.
I'm just chiming in. My name's Luke, Panel Communications Manager here at Westport with Patrick. Just chiming in to talk through some of the questions that are appearing in the chat. First one, interesting one from David, and he was making the comparison with the James Point proposal from BGC back in the day, and saying, after all the studies that Westport has completed, why is the layout so similar to that proposal from the early 2000s, noting that version ultimately didn't go ahead?
Yeah, so with all the studies we've done, so when we inherited this project from the last base, it was quite well identified in the 2019 reports that, hang on, let me just try and get back to it. That'll be. it was really well identified in the 2019 reports that further work needed to be done. They were unclear about whether a breakwater was required, and they sort of indicated that work would be required for that. And they were unclear about a range of other matters, wave action, environment, and sort of that's led to the science program and other activities. So, the initial design we had was further north, quite a long way further north from where we're at the moment. Now, the environmental studies show that if we were further north, we would have a bigger impact on the currents in Cockburn Sound. Sorry, the studies indicated we do need a breakwater because for erosion, for ships to be able to operate, particularly during winter at the berth, the swell comes in from the northwest, not from the southwest. Obviously, the waves don't kick up enough. The wind doesn't kick up enough wave from the southwest. But it identified where there are good cobble reefs. It identified not just where there is seagrass, but where there is actually seafloor which may support new seagrass growth. The science indicated where there is key foraging and other habitats, and where all of this information about other species as well. And it sort of gave us a lot better understanding of the currents in terms of how it drives Cockburn Sound. So interestingly, the option further north had a worse impact. It would have also impacted on Synergy's intakes and outtakes, our energy provider. And those are that's really old infrastructure, and having to build a new port on top of it and then try and plug in a pressurized pipe into a canal cooling system created some real risks really around the stability of our power network if we were going to try and do that. That's really complicated engineering, trying to tie in new to old things. And so we end up with really substantial risks for the wider economy as well in that location, as well as some other impacts, which I won't go into. So we looked at we actually went back and brainstormed about 28 different footprints about how you could get that many containers across that point onto Ankertel Road. We narrowed that down from 28 to 8, which were more sensible. 7, 8. And then from there down to, again, ran that through the environmental filter, ran that through the cost filter, and then shortlisted it down to 3. And went and did a detailed multi-criteria analysis on what the best response was. And in that multi-criteria analysis, really the top 2 factors were the performance of the supply chain in terms of how efficient it was, and the environment and social impacts. Those are the top 2 indicators in terms of driving the final decision to put the port where it is now. So that's really the journey we've got it. We haven't really compared it too much to what was done before without that information. And I would also indicate that I think the BGC option was about a spillover port. So what you would need to have done is keep Fremantle going, invest heavily in Fremantle, keep trucks and rail coming in and out of Fremantle, and then invested in the infrastructure down around Kwinana as well to have a second container port, 22 kilometres away. So it wasn't really, the 2 projects are slightly different in that regard. But there are previous versions. I think Fremantle Ports put up a version where they were proposing an island port where you'd have a thin causeway with trucks going along it, and then the port would sit in the water. But that would have created a lot of dredging in the north of Cockburn Sound to get ships access from the deep water in Cockburn to AMC. So that was on environmental grounds written off as well.
Now, there's a question from Rod. I think this one actually came up in another forum yesterday, so let's try and get to it today. Has a cumulative safety case been conducted in managing hazards with Westport and other surrounding industries?
We had safety built in terms of safety was a sort of a basic consideration, like a foundational consideration in everything. So we looked at the road design network, particularly in the port precinct, in terms of the interface between local traffic along Leith Road and Beard Street and the port operations, and separation distances. And we ran that through the standard main road safety case to make sure it sort of was a standard. It wasn't a differentiator between the options we chose. We will, now that we've got this location sort of set, there is always sort of slight wiggle room within the envelope that has been referred to the EPA. Do further work. We just had a meeting with BP earlier, just around the interface between BP's operation and Westport. And we're actively work with the industries surrounding Westport at the moment And the only one at the moment we're talking about in terms of a safety case in terms of industrial activity is between the BP future planning for our future hydrogen hub and Westport. All the other areas are more concerned with access and permeability in and out of the location for emergencies and so on. And I think we've been able to point out that at the moment there's only 2 lanes in and 2 lanes out of the Kwinana industrial area along Beard and Mason Road. And by the time Westport finishes, there will be 14 lanes in and out. So there's going to be a lot more permeability and access to that location if an emergency pops up.
There's a question from John, which I think I can answer. John's asking, what engineering phase is Westport entering? Confirming we are entering definition. That's what the 273 million funding is for. So this next stage is really, we're calling it definition and construction. So it's a long phase, 15 years. Good question from Mark here. Has any work been done on where the dredge material, which is a massive amount of limestone and caprock, will be dumped?
So at the moment, so obviously there's geophysics going on and the geotechnical program is currently being procured to really, we've got a collection of geotechnical information from all the boreholes and other dredging operations, but obviously as I'm sure the person asking that question would understand, we need to understand that in much more detail throughout the potential channel and turning basin area, but also under the breakwater and quay wall. So that work's being tendered. At the moment, based on that information, we believe that the vast majority of that material will be able to be used in the reclamation of the port. So in fact, we've got more dredge material than we needed for port operation day one. But what we want to try and avoid, there's always going to be small amounts of dredge material on top of the harder rock, which is not suitable for reclamation because it won't compact. So we'll have to find a location for that. But all of the other material we'll be looking at ideally reclaiming the port, and a lot of the port has been done to accommodate the forecast dredging quantities. The other purposes for, obviously this won't work for cap rock or some of those activities, but for some of the sand and other activities we'd be looking at if you can imagine spreading it out on some of the slightly muddy shelf sediments to allow a habitat so we can regrow seagrass in some of those locations. And a lot of the science workers flag the areas which are most likely to be successful in that based on sediment quantity and light attenuation, beach nourishment. And then, there's some of the cobble reefs we're trying to avoid at the moment are actually cap rock dredge spoil from the dredging, which was done years ago for the Callista and channels right near where Westport is being built. So if we do end up with any unsuitable heavy rock material, the opportunity is to create relief on the seafloor, which habitat can grow around.
There's a question about the freight rail network, and it just says, with current limited industrial land availability and high land prices in Kewdale, Forestfield and Kenwick and the Airport North, what's the long-term rail freight network strategy to connect Westport to the rail freight network? So will Bullsbrook, containing cheaper land prices and with the future IMT, be considered?
So we looked at many different intermodal sites around the Perth metropolitan area, and everything from Mundajong to Oakford to Bullsbrook, and in the end we looked at where it was possible for rail to operate to in a way that the rail operator and the intermodal terminal operator will make money, because what we don't want to do is to set up a system where we're sort of establishing intermodal terminals in locations where they're not commercially viable and the state they collapse or the state has to go to assist. So in terms of Bullsbrook, we have identified that Bullsbrook is a potential site in the very long term. But for the foreseeable future and into a couple of decades after Westport opens, the vast majority of intermodal demand will be met through Kenwick, through Forestfield, and through an expanded Kewdale. So at the moment, Kewdale operates as the interstate location for intermodal operations, but the state owns all of the land in that Kewdale location. And so it will be looking with the Commonwealth Government about how we can have an integrated intermodal terminal connected with the industrial land around it. People may have seen Things like Moorebank over in the eastern states is an example of that integrated industry and intermodal terminal. Well, the Kewdale site is about 8 times bigger than, and the industrial area about 8 times bigger than that. So there's a lot of opportunity for it. But we have sort of indicated that land should be retained and protected in some way, shape or form in Bullsbrook to allow a potential future intermodal terminal. There is an action from Infrastructure WA's state infrastructure strategy to develop a Perth freights strategy, and that's something Department of Transport will be doing. And my assumption is the work we've done will fold into that in terms of the long-term strategy beyond Westport.
There's a good question from Philip here regards environmental approvals. He's saying, are the environmental approvals for the road and rail network being handled separately or through the Westport PER?
Separately. So the approvals have to be secured by the asset owners, obviously, because they're going to have conditions and clauses that those operators would need to make sure they comply with forevermore, effectively in some respects. So Anketel Road was submitted to the EPA by Main Roads, Western Australia. So Main Roads is obviously part of Westport, and they will be developing, or that they're progressing that PER. Similarly, the same would be done for Rowley and Kwinana, although I should make the point that the widening for Kwinana and Rowley happens within the existing corridor. There's no widening of the corridor. They were always intended to have additional lanes. And then the PTA will be the proponent for the rail line. Now, there's not a lot of ecological impact through the rail lines, but obviously social surrounds, noise and vibration will be something that we need to focus on in that PER process. So we're dealing with the marine. Main Roads has submitted the Anketel and we'll do the other roads, and PTA will do the rail. Yeah.
Great. We've got time for a couple more. There's a few that have just come through regarding the new shipping channel. Yeah. There was one that was really asking, can you discuss the channel? Will it be one way in and out or exclusive for defence and commercial? So there's a question around that. And another question around, can you explain the length and dimensions of the proposed channel? What are we trying to cater for? What ship size are we catering for in the future?
Yeah. So to the first question, no, there is no intent at the moment for us to prescribe how navigation would be managed. We selected a second channel because, counterintuitively, if you widened the first channel, you would have much greater impact on seagrass, because seagrass has grown right up to the edge of the existing channel through those areas, and putting a larger channel through the old dredging scars and into deeper water, we have a lower direct impact on seagrass by quite a margin. So in terms of the operation of it, the Fremantle Port Authority, once they're operating the asset, the harbour master is very involved with us, and they'll come up with a sort of a navigation plan and management of it. I think both will be operating collectively. There won't be any I wouldn't have imagined there's any specific limitations on which vessel can go through which channel. I would notice with submarines and defence, we have submarines going in and out of Cockburn Sound all the time already. And there's pretty well understood protocols in terms of other ships just giving a little bit of time for them to get through the existing channel into that location. So no, there's no intent for us to sort of limit. It would be what is the most optimal flow of vessels through that location, through those two channels, which would be determined by the harbour master. In terms of the dimensions, I don't have them to hand, but I believe, but I'm pretty sure we've sized the channels for the larger vessels. There is a limited difference between the 18,000, the 14,000 TEU vessels that would have to go there. We did a lot of real-time, both static, but then also real-time simulations. I was talking to someone about this today. We brought down some of the vessel captains and pilots from Europe, where they are, using these large ships from day to day on a day-to-day basis. we used a pretty advanced simulator to put those ships through these channels and then apply, almost cyclone type storms to it from the side, power loss situations and rudder loss situations to see what would happen, to help understand the dimensions of a channel to both balance the fact that we don't want to over dredge because of the environmental impacts and the cost, frankly, but we also want to make sure it's a very safe channel for ships of a considerable size. So, we probably went, we've got a conservative channel at the moment in terms of its depth. I think it's about 17.5 meters through the banks into Coburn Sound, and we will continue to refine that, obviously, as we go through the next stage of definition, which is part of what you're supposed to do at this phase is optimize what you've got. We just didn't want to go into the environmental approvals process with something that was small and then might get bigger. It's much better to sort of say this is as big as it could possibly be and then get smaller afterwards.
Great. And there's just one more question here that we might throw in the mix, which was just a bit of a political question, but let's answer it while we're all here. And it was just asking, if the project is deemed viable, is there a risk to the project proceeding in the event of a change of government, or is there general bipartisan support?
Look, I really can't answer the last question. What I think we've done is to provide a really compelling economic case for doing this project. Depending on the discount rate, I think we're talking this project at a 4%, which is 4% rate. The BCR, or the benefit versus the cost, is about 4, which means it's 4 times better for the economy than the cost of building it, which is a very high. And even if you had a more savage discount rate to that, you're still talking around about 2, so twice as good for the economy as not building, which is really good, particularly for something where we're not including all the benefits. For example, the benefits of additional shipping costs weren't included, the additional benefits of the Fremantle redevelopment. So I think what we've done is the team's done an exceptional job in considering everything and then coming up with a conservative economic picture rather than trying to gild the lily. And it just so clearly stacks up. It's so important to the economy. Now, a future government, they can do what they want with that. Of course, we are public servants. We're agnostic to future governments. Our job is to make sure we give them the best advice we can, and that's what I think we've done here. If governments do want to deviate from this, then we'd obviously it would be a complicated situation to come up with a plan B, if you like, for moving import to here, because we are not blessed like the eastern states are with lots of embayments and river mouths of a scale which you can build a port safely, and we really need to build it close to Perth, and this is the best location for it.
Great. Thanks, Patrick. Look, I think we'll wrap it up there. Appreciate the questions. Thanks for sending them through. We will make this presentation publicly available, and again, encourage everyone to, there's a SurveyMonkey link. Be great to get your feedback, understand, how the information has landed with you, and if it's sort of hitting the mark, if it's what you want to know. I think one of the things about Westport is it's such a beast of a program. It's so large that often, we're trying to understand what is the information that the community really wants to understand, and that's part of the driver behind the survey that we ran. So yeah, I would encourage you, please complete the survey, and it will help us, tailor our future information to suit your needs. So thanks again. Thanks to Patrick, and thanks to everyone for your time today.
Thanks all.